Jeff Arnett, or Jeff Jensen Arnett, is the most famous person known for ideas on emerging adulthood and research on emerging adulthood. He's still studying emerging adults today. I've never met him personally, but I have seen him speak at conferences. So again, the first question, you see that the Arnett citation is from the year 2000, so actually when I was 18 years old. But do you feel that you have reached adulthood? So let's look at this figure first before we go to the blue box. So you see that there were individuals broken into different groups. So the 12 to 17-year-olds, as one could imagine, that not very many of them, but still a sizable amount, but not many. 20% said, yes, I do feel like an adult. We have, more saying no, and there were quite a few that said yes and no. When we jump to the older guys in this data set, we see the 36 to 55-year-olds, most of them, 90% are saying, yes, I feel like an adult, but still not everybody. And that could be for multiple reasons, like how do we define adulthood anyway? The most critical group to look at are these 18 to 25-year-olds. And you see that about 40% of this group said yes to this question. I do feel like I've reached adulthood. But there were less people, considerably less people that said no. However, look at that green box. It's almost 60% of that group said yes and no. In some ways, I feel like an adult, but in other ways, I don't. Almost 60%. Now going to the blue box, again, this is the original data that I'm presenting here from Arnett from 2000 that informed our understanding of emerging adulthood. We have updated data. I know 2012 is still dated, and this is going to be representing millennials to a greater degree than Gen Z. So we can argue what this would look like today. But in a sample, this is also Arnett's data, but from just 12 years later, 45% of 18 to 29-year-olds chose the yes and no response. So less than in the year 2000, which was 60% or almost 60%. But in 2012, 45% still said, yes and no. Unsurprisingly, as I already mentioned in our own class data that I would hypothesize would show up, responses were skewed by age. So the younger late adolescents, 18 to 21-year-olds, 61% of them said in some ways yes, in some ways no. So it's kind of getting closer to that number that was presented in the 2000 data. And when we get to the older individuals who are part of emerging adulthood, you see that only 39% said yes and no. And again, those are for the 26 to 29-year-olds. So it does depend on your age. And you see that this does go to 29 instead of just 25 in the box compared to the box that we have here. So just in general, I wanted to present more updated data than the 2000 data, although again, I am fully aware that 2012 is still 8 years ago. So think about, we don't have data from 2019 that I can show you, otherwise I would. And so just let's think about how it would look today. Would these numbers look pretty similar? Do you think they would look different? Do you think that more people would say they do feel like an adult or less people? It's an empirical question. According to work by Arnett and others, there tends to be 5 main features of emerging adulthood. So essentially, if we were to look at the average person who falls into this category of emerging adulthood, what kinds of behaviors or cognitions or attitudes do we see among them? And we'll talk about how universal each of these features are after I talk about them just broadly. So the first one we've already talked about, and it goes back to that data from 2000 and later 2012. The idea that there are individuals who do feel in between. So the subjective feelings, it's these I feel statements between adolescence and adulthood. So this is the answer yes and no. So Arnett and others argue that for individuals who are emerging adults, they feel that way. They know that they're between. In some ways they may feel like adults, but in other ways they don't. The second main feature is that emerging adults are really exploring their possible identities before making enduring choices. This is related to all areas of their life, or potentially could be related to all areas of their life. And we've already talked about Erickson's notions on identity in adolescence. And we've also talked about how identity isn't necessarily just an adolescent phenomena, it's a lifespan issue. So in emerging adulthood, the research is suggesting that individuals are thinking about what they're capable of, or what their limits may be, what they believe, what they value. So it's a continuation from adolescence into this time period, but you're making these decisions and you're testing them out in a way that you might not have been able to in adolescence. So, for example, for a career, you're not necessarily able to try that out in adolescence, but by the time that you are post college, let's say, and before you're jumping into a forever job, if there is such a thing anymore, then you're trying out these different types of jobs to see, is this me? Is this what I want to do? Is this something that I want to do for a long time or forever? So it's an exploration time period. The third main feature is one that's exceedingly common, and this broadly is just instability. Instability in your life. It could be in work matters, relationships, and or living arrangements. So this means that you might be jumping from job to job, again trying to figure out based on your identity if this is right for you, or maybe it's just that you're finding jobs that are paying the bills in the moment, but you're not able to find a job that you want to do for the rest of your life. Relationships, it might be the case that you are dating somebody for the moment. Maybe it's not a forever person and you don't see them in that way, but it's fun to date them in the moment or just for now. I think about how Tinder plays a role in all of this and the other dating apps, but it's more like dating around and or not feeling like I'm gonna marry, if that's a goal, this person. Living arrangements. I like this one because I think of my sister who has had over 30 roommates since she was let's say 18 years old. And that's because she's lived with different people in different apartments in different situations. It's this waiting to settle down and let's say buy a condo or an apartment or a house, just jumping from living arrangement to living arrangement. Maybe living with a partner and then that relationship ends, so you're no longer living with that partner. This data is somewhat dated still, but about 40% of emerging adults move back with their parents at least once. And I'm sure it's not surprising to you, but residential change is highest between this age group. So individuals between 18 and 29, that tail end of emerging adulthood, are more likely to be jumping from living arrangement to living arrangement. When we talk about this third one being a main feature, does it mean that every single person has instability in all three of those areas? So work, relationships, and living arrangements? No, not necessarily. It could be the case that you are settled in one of those areas, but not so much in the others, and you'd still be classified as an emerging adult. Again, just using this as one of the main features. The fourth main feature is one that people who are outside emerging adulthood don't always understand. And what I mean by this is the fourth feature is that it's a focus on oneself and on functioning as an independent person. So essentially, let's say older generation, maybe parents or others, might see this time period as an emerging adult or individual being pretty selfish, like making decisions that seem to be just about them without considering others. But what Arnett and others argue is that this time period is really important. We've already talked about identity, but this is an important time to take a break, and think about who you are and develop the knowledge and skills and self-understanding that we really need for adult life, which is ultimately also related to autonomy development. So it's a focus on yourself. I think back to my sister again, and she wanted to move across the country for this crazy job experience. And I remember my mom saying to her, like, "Why aren't you thinking of me? Like, you're just gonna like leave us behind." And my sister, who ultimately didn't choose that job, she chose a different job, but she was thinking on herself, like, maybe this is something that I want to do. Maybe these are the skills that I need to be practicing to be living independently, and trying something different out. So again, some people see this as a selfish move or making selfish decisions, but you're practicing those autonomy skills, those decision making skills that are so crucial for adult life. The fifth main feature is one that's more positive than maybe some of these others, and it's the subjective sense that life holds many possibilities. So it's definitely a positive, optimistic outlook that is coming along with these other features. So if we were in class, I would be asking you this question. How many of you feel confident that someday you'll get to be where you want to be in life? And usually the vast majority of class is going to raise your hand. And the reason is good. Like, if we don't think that life holds any possibilities for us, we may not be as motivated to try new things or to go out there to try to achieve different goals. We also see this in young children, by the way. We call them positive illusions, where we might have talked about these in class earlier in the term, but this idea that if we don't have these positive illusions of like, no, I don't think that I can do it, we may not even try. So in early data from our net, 89% of emerging adulthood or emerging adults agreed with that statement that I'm confident that someday I'll get to be where I want out of life. And more recent data from 2014 showed that 83% agreed with the statement, at this time of my life, anything is possible. That is a sizable number. If I asked you right now, how many of you have parents or know other adults who are unhappy with their jobs or their financial situation, or who have crappy relationships, or who've had divorces, or who have children who are naughty and disrespectful? If we look at all of those things, then 83% seems pretty high, that we probably know quite a few people who aren't where they want to be in life, or they didn't anticipate this. But during the time period of emerging adulthood, we are more positive because we're trying to figure things out. And so the fact that 80% or 80 plus percent are saying that, I'm pretty optimistic I'm where I'm going to be, this is really beneficial for us because it's allowing us to try new things. Yes, we can't predict the future, and we'll never be able to do that, but at least we're trying to figure out who we are again and who we want to be.